The Zephyrian Council had ruled the Outer Rim for 3,000 years. Their crystalline cities floated in the void between stars, powered by technologies that bent space and time to their will. They were ancient, wise, and utterly convinced of their superiority over the primitive species that crawled across planetary surfaces. Commander Veltar stood before the massive viewing portal of the flagship Eternal Dominion, watching the blue-green world turn slowly below. Earth, the humans called it. Such a simple name for such a simple species. The planet looked peaceful enough, with its swirling white clouds and vast oceans. No orbital defenses, no energy shields, no signs of advanced technology. Just another backward world ready for harvesting. Begin the standard protocol, Veltar commanded, his voice carrying the authority of countless conquered worlds. Deploy the fierce ships. Let them see their doom approaching. Across the bridge, his subordinates moved with practiced efficiency. The Zephyrians had perfected the art of psychological warfare over millennia. First came the fierce ships, massive vessels designed to inspire terror with their twisted, organic shapes and pulsing red lights. They would hover over major population centers, broadcasting images of destruction and demands for surrender. Most species capitulated within hours. The first wave of fierce ships descended through Earth's atmosphere, their hulls crackling with energy that made the very air scream. They positioned themselves over New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing, Moscow, the power centers of human civilization. The broadcasts began immediately, showing holographic displays of other conquered worlds, their cities burning, their populations enslaved. But something was wrong. Instead of panic and immediate surrender, the humans did something unprecedented. They fought back, not with energy weapons or force fields or the advanced technologies the Zephyrians expected. They fought with primitive kinetic weapons, explosives, and projectiles that shouldn't have been able to penetrate even basic shielding. Yet somehow, impossibly, the attacks were working. "Sir," came a worried voice from the communications station. "Fear Ship Designation 7 is reporting significant damage. The humans are using some kind of, they're calling them missiles apparently." Veltar's crystalline features shifted in confusion. "Impossible. Scan their technology levels. They shouldn't even have achieved interplanetary travel." The scans confirmed what they already knew. The humans were barely more advanced than their own ancestors had been when the Zephyrians first achieved spaceflight. Chemical rockets, nuclear fission, primitive electronics. Yet their weapons were somehow bypassing shields that had protected Zephyrian vessels for centuries. "Analysis complete, sir," reported the tactical officer. "Their projectiles appear to be using a form of adaptive targeting. Each missile learns from the previous one's failure and adjusts its approach. It's crude, but effective." Veltar felt the first stirring of unease. In 3,000 years of conquest, no primitive species had ever posed a real threat to Zephyrian technology. "Deploy the pacification fields. Render their weapons inoperative." The pacification fields were a Zephyrian specialty, energy waves that disrupted the electromagnetic spectrum, making most electronic devices simply stop working. Entire civilizations had been brought to their knees as their technology failed around them. But the humans adapted again. Within hours, they had somehow shielded their most critical systems. Within days, they had developed countermeasures that actually began to interfere with the pacification fields themselves. It was impossible, yet it was happening. "Sir," the communications officer's voice was now tight, with something approaching fear. "We're receiving transmissions from the planet. They're threatening us." Veltar's laugh was brittle. "Threatening? Play the transmission." The voice that filled the bridge was calm, measured, and utterly terrifying in its quiet confidence. "This is Secretary General Harrison of the United Nations. You have entered our solar system uninvited and attacked our world. You have exactly 24 hours to withdraw all forces. If you do not comply, we will be forced to take defensive action." Defensive action? Veltar couldn't believe what he was hearing. They're issuing ultimatums? To us. But doubt was beginning to creep into his voice. The humans had already done the impossible twice, damaged their ships, and adapted to their technology. What else might they be capable of? The answer came 18 hours later. It started as a small disturbance on the edge of their sensor range. A single object, roughly cylindrical, rising from Earth's surface on a pillar of fire. The sensors classified it as a primitive chemical rocket, no threat to anything. Then, it exploded. The explosion wasn't nuclear. The Zephyrians would have recognized that signature immediately. It wasn't antimatter either, or any form of exotic energy they knew. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to tear at the very fabric of space-time itself. The shockwave that followed wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that resonated with the fundamental forces of the universe. It washed over the Zephyrian fleet like a tide, and, where it passed, impossible things began to happen. Ships that had been protected by shields for millennia suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Energy systems that had operated flawlessly for centuries began to fluctuate. Most disturbing of all, the ancient AI systems that controlled many of their vessels began to report errors, not malfunctions, but actual uncertainty about basic physical laws. What was that? Veltar demanded, his composure finally beginning to crack. Unknown, sir. The energy signature doesn't match anything in our databases. It appears to have been some form of reality adjustment. Reality adjustment? That's impossible. But, even as he said it, Veltar was beginning to realize that impossible might not mean what he thought it meant when dealing with humans. The second missile launched 6 hours later. This one was different, larger, more complex. The Zephyrian sensors tracked it as it rose from Earth's surface, but they couldn't get a clear reading on its payload. The energy signatures were shifting, changing, adapting even as they watched. Intercept it, Veltar ordered. The defense grid responded instantly. Energy beams lanced out from a dozen ships, converging on the rising missile. They should have vaporized it instantly. Instead, the missile absorbed the energy, not deflected it or avoided it. Absorbed it, somehow incorporating the attack into its own structure. The sensors showed the weapon actually growing larger and more complex as it fed on their defensive fire. Cease fire, Veltar shouted, but it was too late. The missile had reached optimal position, roughly halfway between Earth and the Zephyrian fleet. For a moment, it simply hung there in space, pulsing with absorbed energy. Then, it began to unfold. What emerged defied every law of physics the Zephyrians understood. The missile didn't just explode. It bloomed, expanding in directions that shouldn't have existed, creating structures that folded space around them like origami. The very stars seemed to bend as reality warped around the expanding phenomenon. And then, from within that impossible flower of twisted space-time, came the humans. Not in ships. The Zephyrians would have understood ships. These were structures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, sliding through dimensions that the Zephyrians hadn't even known existed. They were beautiful and terrifying, following no design philosophy that any sane species would have developed. The largest of the human vessels, if it could be called a vessel, materialized directly in front of the Eternal Dominion. It was roughly the same size as the Zephyrian flagship, but where the Dominion was elegant and crystalline, this human creation was organic and chaotic. It looked like it had been grown rather than built, its hull rippling with patterns that hurt to look at directly. A transmission came through on frequencies that shouldn't have been able to penetrate Zephyrian shielding. This is Admiral Chun of the Terran Defense Force. You were warned. You chose not to listen. Prepare to learn why that was a mistake. The human ship didn't fire weapons in any conventional sense. Instead, it began to sing. The sound shouldn't have been able to travel through the vacuum of space, but it did. It was a harmony of impossible complexity, notes that seemed to resonate with the quantum foam itself. And, as it sang, the Zephyrian fleet began to come apart. Not destroyed. That would have been merciful. The ships began to phase in and out of reality, their crews experiencing moments where they existed and moments where they simply didn't. The ancient Zephyrian technology, which had seemed so advanced, revealed itself to be based on principles that were apparently far more limited than anyone had imagined. How? Veltar whispered, watching his fleet dissolve around him. How is this possible? You're primitives. You barely have space travel. The response came not through the communication system, but directly into his mind. Another impossibility that was rapidly becoming commonplace. That's your mistake, the voice said, carrying traces of amusement alongside its steel. You assumed that advancement had to follow your path. You mastered space and time, built perfect cities, conquered 1,000 worlds. Very impressive. But you never learned to dream impossible dreams. You never learned that sometimes the universe listens when you ask it nicely to break its own rules. Around the Eternal Dominion, the last of the fierce ships were disappearing into whatever dimensional pocket the humans had created for them. The crews weren't dead. The sensors confirmed they were still alive, still conscious. They were just elsewhere. Your people are safe, Admiral Chen's voice continued. Uncomfortable and probably very confused, but safe. We're not killers by nature. But neither are we prey. What do you want? Veltar found himself asking. For you to leave. Go back to your crystal cities and your perfect order. Tell the galaxy that Earth is under protection now. Tell them that humanity has learned to weaponize creativity itself. The Eternal Dominion shuddered as the human vessel's song reached a new crescendo. For a terrifying moment, Veltar felt the ship beginning to phase out of reality. Then, the singing stopped, and they snapped back into normal space with jarring suddenness. That was a warning, Chen said. The next song will be less gentle. You have 1 hour to collect your scattered vessels and leave this system. Do not return. As the human vessels faded back into whatever impossible space they had emerged from, Veltar stood in stunned silence. Around him, his bridge crew worked frantically to re-establish contact with the rest of the fleet, those ships that still existed in recognizable form. The humans had done the impossible. They had taken technology barely beyond their own Stone Age and somehow twisted it into weapons that could challenge the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. They had looked at the laws of physics and simply opted out of the ones they didn't like. Sir, the communications officer reported, his voice shaky. We're receiving distress signals from 12 vessels. They're reporting that they're currently existing in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Veltar closed his eyes. 3,000 years of conquest. And it ended here, defeated by a species that had somehow learned to make the universe itself fight on their side. Begin recovery operations, he said quietly. And prepare a message for the High Council. Tell them we need to reconsider our expansion policies. As the Zephyrian fleet began its retreat, Earth continued its slow rotation below, looking exactly as peaceful and primitive as it had when they first arrived. The only difference was that now, deep in facilities hidden beneath mountains and ocean floors, human scientists were already working on the next generation of impossible weapons. After all, they had learned something important today. The universe was much stranger and more flexible than anyone had imagined. And humans, it turned out, had a particular talent for making friends with strangeness. News of the Zephyrian defeat spread through the galaxy like wildfire through dry leaves. In the great trading centers and diplomatic hubs, in the military academies and research stations, the impossible story was told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. The Thraxian Empire, masters of biological warfare, dismissed it as Zephyrian propaganda designed to cover up their own incompetence. The Nexus Collective, with their perfect machine logic, calculated that the reports contained too many statistical impossibilities to be accurate. The Void touched, ancient beings who had learned to manipulate dark matter itself, simply refused to believe that any species could develop such capabilities so quickly. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Commander Kextol of the Thraxian Biofleet studied the sensor readings for the 1,000th time, his secondary brain processing the quantum signatures while his primary consciousness wrestled with the implications. The data was clear, verified through 17 different analysis protocols. The humans had somehow created weapons that operated outside the standard physics framework. Impossible, he chittered through his breathing slits. Biochemical evolution doesn't permit such rapid technological advancement. It violates every principle of organic development. His aide, a younger Thraxian with bright green carapace markings indicating recent molting, shifted nervously. Sir, perhaps we should consider the possibility that human evolution followed different parameters than our models predict. Kextol's eye stalks swiveled to focus on the younger officer. Different parameters? They're carbon-based bipeds with primitive neural architecture. I've seen their biological scans from the Zephyrian archives. Standard primate development. Nothing exceptional. Yes, sir. but their cultural evolution patterns seemed to be unusual. The commander brought up the human data files, scrolling through biological and technological assessments compiled by dozens of galactic civilizations over the past several thousand years. The picture they painted was of a species that should have been unremarkable, short-lived, aggressive, technologically limited. Yet somehow, in the span of less than a century, they had gone from primitive nuclear weapons to reality-warping devices that could challenge the most advanced species in known space. "Show me the human development timeline," Kextol ordered. The holographic display materialized above his workstation, showing human technological progress over the past 1,000 years. For most of that time, the curve was predictably shallow, slow improvements in metallurgy, gradual advances in mathematics and engineering. Then, around their year 1900, something changed. The technological advancement curve didn't just steepen, it went nearly vertical. In less than 2 centuries, humans had progressed from horse-drawn transportation to interplanetary travel, from mechanical computation to quantum processors, from chemical explosives to whatever impossible weapons they had used against the Zephyrians. This acceleration pattern is unprecedented, Kextol mused. Even accounting for exponential technological growth, this represents a rate of development that should be biologically impossible. "Sir," the aide ventured, "what if their development wasn't purely biological?" The commander's attention sharpened. "Explain." "Well, sir, most species develop technology through gradual refinement of existing knowledge. But humans seem to have a unique approach. They regularly abandon proven methods in favor of completely new paradigms. Our analysts call it paradigm jumping." Kextol examined the data more closely. The aide was right. Where other species would incrementally improve their transportation methods, humans had repeatedly thrown out their entire approach and started over. From animal power to steam engines to internal combustion to jet propulsion to rocket technology, each transition represented not just an improvement, but a fundamental reconceptualization of the problem. "They don't optimize," Kextol realized. "They reimagine." "Yes, sir." And, apparently, when they reimagined physics itself, the implication hung in the air between them. If humans could treat the laws of physics as just another paradigm to be jumped, rather than immutable constraints to work within, then their potential for technological surprise was essentially unlimited. "Signal the War Council," Kextol ordered. "Cancel the Earth invasion plans." Immediately, the aide's carapace shifted to a confused blue-green. "Sir, our biological weapons are specifically designed to target human physiology. We could eliminate them before they have a chance to deploy their new technologies." "No," Kextol said firmly. "You're still thinking like a Thraxian. You're assuming that their defenses will be based on conventional countermeasures. But what if they've reimagined biology itself?" The question proved to be more prophetic than he could have imagined. Halfway across the galaxy, in the sterile laboratories of the Nexus Collective, Machine Intelligence Unit 7742 was processing the same data with very different conclusions. Unlike the organic species of the galaxy, the Collective didn't experience emotions like fear or confusion. They simply analyzed, computed, and acted on the results. The analysis was troubling. Human technological development violates 17 fundamental principles of logical advancement, reported Subunit 3891. Their progression follows no recognizable pattern. Unit 7742 processed this information through its advanced logic matrices. The Collective had spent millennia perfecting the art of technological development, creating systematic approaches that guaranteed steady, predictable progress. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that logical analysis would always identify the optimal solution to any problem. Humans appeared to violate this principle entirely. "Display human problem-solving methodologies," 7742 requested. The data was disturbing. Where the Collective would analyze a problem through exhaustive calculation and implement the mathematically optimal solution, humans seemed to use something they called intuition, a decision-making process that appeared to be based on incomplete data and emotional responses. It should have made them inferior. Instead, somehow, it made them unpredictable in ways that even the Collective's most advanced predictive algorithms couldn't account for. Analysis, Human decision-making incorporates variables that our models do not recognize, reported 3891. They appear to include factors that have no logical basis in their calculations. Specify these factors, 7742 requested. Hope, stubbornness, what they call thinking outside the box, and something they refer to as spite. Unit 7742 processed this for several microseconds, an eternity in machine terms. Hope was the emotional response to uncertain outcomes that should logically be irrelevant to actual probability. Stubbornness was persistence in the face of evidence suggesting a course of action was suboptimal. Thinking outside the box appeared to be a deliberate rejection of established parameters. And spite. Spite was taking action purely to defy expectations, regardless of personal cost or logical benefit. Conclusion: human decision-making processes incorporate deliberate irrationality as a strategic advantage. 7742 finally announced. The implications were staggering. The collective had always assumed that optimal decision-making required perfect logic. But if humans could achieve superior results through deliberate rejection of logical constraints, initiate Protocol 7. 7742 commanded. All human contact is to be avoided until further analysis is complete. Classification: unknown paradigm threat. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out in the councils and command centers of a dozen major civilizations. The humans had done more than defeat the Zephyrians. They had invalidated every assumption about how technological development was supposed to work. But in the deep void between stars, in regions where space itself grew thin and strange, ancient beings stirred who had been watching the galaxy's development for millions of years. The architects had seen civilizations rise and fall, had witnessed the birth and death of entire species. They had thought they understood the patterns of cosmic development. The humans were forcing them to reconsider. In dimensions that existed parallel to normal space, the Architect Council convened for the first time in 10,000 years. They were beings of pure thought and crystallized time, entities so advanced that matter itself was merely a tool they used for convenience. The young species violates the natural order, communicated Architect Prime, its thoughts rippling through folded space. They have accessed principles that should not be available to their level of development. Indeed, agreed Architect Secundus. They appear to have discovered metaphysics, the ability to manipulate the underlying framework of reality itself. This was not predicted in any development model. The architects had long believed that technological advancement followed a strict hierarchy. Physical mastery came first, learning to manipulate matter and energy. Then came dimensional mastery, the ability to work with space and time. Finally, at the very pinnacle of development, came reality mastery, the power to alter the fundamental laws of existence itself. Humans had somehow skipped the first two stages entirely. How is this possible? Asked Architect Tertius, its ancient mind struggling to process the contradiction. Analysis suggests they never learned to accept limitations as permanent, Prime responded. Where other species learn the laws of physics as constraints, humans appear to treat them as guidelines. This was unprecedented. Every species the architects had observed had gone through the same basic progression, learning to work within the laws of reality, then gradually expanding their understanding until they could begin to manipulate those laws at the highest levels. Humans seem to have started with the assumption that any law could be changed if you just approached it correctly. They are dangerous, Secundus declared. A species with reality manipulation capabilities, but without the wisdom that comes from proper development sequence. They could destabilize the entire cosmic framework. Or, Prime suggested, they could represent a new form of evolution entirely. Perhaps our understanding of proper development has been limited. The debate that followed would have lasted centuries if measured in standard time. But the architects existed partially outside temporal flow, so it was both instantaneous and eternal. In the end, they reached a consensus that surprised even themselves. We will observe, Prime announced. The humans will be allowed to continue their development unimpeded. If they prove to be a threat to cosmic stability, we will intervene. If they prove to be a new form of evolutionary advancement, we will learn from them. Secundus completed the thought. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the underground laboratory where humanity's impossible weapons had been born, unaware that the fate of cosmic evolution itself might hinge on her next breakthrough. The quantum resonance patterns are stabilizing, she reported to her team. We're ready to begin testing the next generation of defensive systems. Her colleague, Dr. James Morrison, looked up from his workstation with a grin that would have terrified galactic civilizations. Good, because I've been working on something new. What if we could convince the universe that our enemies never existed in the first place? Chen raised an eyebrow. Retroactive reality editing? That's impossible. Sarah, Morrison laughed. When has that ever stopped us? Across the galaxy, monitoring stations belonging to dozens of species simultaneously detected a brief fluctuation in the quantum foam, a momentary suggestion that reality itself was considering a revision. The fluctuation lasted only nanoseconds before the universe apparently decided against whatever change had been proposed. But the fact that the change had been proposed at all sent shockwaves through every civilization advanced enough to detect it. The humans weren't just weaponizing creativity. They were teaching the universe itself to be creative. And that, everyone agreed, was the most terrifying prospect any of them could imagine. The crisis began with what should have been a routine diplomatic mission. Ambassador Tvak of the Stellar Concordium had requested a formal meeting with human representatives to establish trade relations. The Concordium was one of the older galactic powers, known for their careful, methodical approach to everything. They had survived for 12,000 years by never taking